It was an event that haunted the world for years, shrouded in mystery, fear, and unanswered questions. After the First World War ended, when global economies lay in ruins, a husband and wife made a bold choice. They abandoned everything and moved to a remote, deserted island, one that was as beautiful as it was mysterious. At first, the island felt like a dream come true. But slowly, that dream twisted into a nightmare. Hunger, thirst, betrayal, and bloodshed became part of their daily struggle. As time passed, more people arrived, each with their own secret ambitions. Some came chasing wealth and fame, others came searching for peace and meaning. But the island had a truth of its own, one that no one truly understood. After the Great War, the world's economy was hanging by a thread. In those desperate times, one couple left civilization behind and made their home on an isolated island far away from everything. The man, Dr. Ritter, often wrote letters that passing ships would collect and deliver to the world beyond. Through those letters, people everywhere came to know his story. Ritter believed that true peace only comes after struggle, that when life gives you everything too easily, you forget the value of effort and growth. Years later, another family arrived, Hans, his wife Margaret, and their young son Harry. They had sold everything they owned, determined to spend the rest of their lives on that same island. Hans was deeply inspired by Ritter's letters, almost obsessed with his ideals, so he came all the way to meet him in person. He told Ritter's wife that the doctor's letters had become quite famous in Germany, but the couple seemed unimpressed. Ritter personally took Hans to his garden and tried to warn him, the island wasn't the paradise he imagined. It was cut off from the world, harsh and unforgiving. He advised Hans to turn back before it was too late. But Hans had already made up his mind, he wasn't leaving. So Ritter led them to a cave on the far side of the island and told them they could live there, though he warned them of one crucial danger: water was scarce. Survival depended entirely on collecting rain. After Ritter left, Hans and his family immediately began preparing for the rainy season. They built a crude pipeline that funneled rainwater into a pit, a simple but vital lifeline. Meanwhile, Dora, Ritter's wife, grew uneasy. She confessed to her husband that she didn't like the idea of the new family living there. Ritter reassured her, explaining that he had left them in a barren area where crops couldn't grow and water was hard to find. In his eyes, they wouldn't last long. Dora seemed comforted by that cruel certainty. But Margaret was determined to survive. The nights were full of eerie sounds, buzzing insects, wild animals lurking nearby, whispers of the unknown. She barely slept, yet never once complained or mentioned leaving. Soon, it was revealed that she was pregnant, and despite everything, Hans was overjoyed. Both families continued with their lives, but one day, the island trembled with the sound of a cannon-like explosion. Everyone rushed outside to see a massive ship approaching from the sea. When it anchored, a striking woman stepped ashore. Her name was Eloise. Two men followed her, Robert and Rudy, both seemingly obsessed with her. As Eloise gazed at the lonely island, she smiled in awe, mesmerized by its haunting beauty. The moment Eloise stepped onto that lonely island, one thought struck her instantly: this place could be a paradise for the rich. She looked around and imagined a luxury resort rising out of the wilderness. Soon, she learned that this was the very island where the famous Dr. Ritter lived, the man whose letters had fascinated people all around the world. Eloise decided to meet his partner, Dora. She arrived flaunting her wealth and confidence, proudly declaring her plan to build a lavish resort right there on the island. As they talked, Dr. Ritter suddenly appeared, completely unclothed and unbothered. Eloise, taken aback but intrigued, showered him with compliments, calling it an honor to meet the man who had mastered nature with his bare hands. Ritter, however, was less impressed. He simply asked where they were staying. Eloise replied casually, by the shore. Later, everyone was seen bathing in a freshwater pool, a pool that Hans and his family had built with weeks of hard labor. When Hans saw strangers using it, his anger exploded. Eloise quickly apologized and introduced herself as their new neighbor, explaining her dream of building a resort for billionaires seeking exotic adventures. To make peace, she handed Hans a few letters from the mainland, asking him to deliver them to Ritter. But when Hans passed them along, Ritter noticed that the envelopes had already been opened. Furious, he accused Hans of reading them. Hans denied it, realizing at once that Eloise must have been behind it. Confronting her, he demanded to know why she was trying to turn them against each other. But Eloise coldly replied that she had nothing to do with it, claiming Ritter himself had told her about the freshwater pool. That was the moment Hans understood: Ritter didn't want them on the island. Eloise then proudly showed Hans her blueprint for the future resort, an extravagant playground for the ultra-rich. To Hans, the idea was absurd. He called it a sickness, a fantasy that could never survive in a place so brutal and unforgiving. His blunt words wiped the smile off Eloise's face, and she walked away in silence. Days later, when Ritter ran out of food, desperation forced him to Hans's home. By chance, Hans had just hunted a wild animal. Seeing the doctor's condition, he shared some of the meat with him. Slowly, time passed. The rainy season crept closer, and though the heat was still unbearable, Hans and his family had nearly finished building their small home. They had even managed to grow vegetables in their new garden, their first sign of true progress. Meanwhile, things weren't going well for Rudy. No matter how hard he tried, he achieved nothing. Frustration and hunger twisted his temper. One evening, he returned to camp to find Eloise and Robert laughing and drinking together. Already on edge, Rudy snapped when Eloise casually asked him for food. He shouted that they had nothing left to eat or drink, and blamed her for everything. "It's all your fault," he yelled. "You and your stupid dreams brought us here to die." Humiliated, Eloise's face burned with rage and tears. Without a word, she stormed off into the dark jungle. Back at Hans's camp, Margaret was alone, busy with her chores. From a distance, Robert and another man named Manuel were secretly watching her. Suddenly, she felt a sharp pain in her stomach, far too early for her baby to come. She cried out, clutching her belly, but her husband and son were miles away, out hunting. Left completely alone, Margaret had no choice but to endure the pain herself. Just then, Manuel and Robert crept into her hut, hoping to steal whatever they could. But before they got far, Margaret stumbled back inside, sweating, trembling, barely able to stand. She was in labor. With no one around to help, she began to deliver her baby on her own. The two men stood frozen, watching in silence instead of helping. Suddenly, the sound of goats screaming shattered the tense air. Margaret rushed outside, clutching her stomach, only to find wild dogs attacking them. She tried to fight them off, but she was weak, her pain unbearable. She collapsed on the ground, crying out, and there, alone under the open sky, she gave birth to her child. The dogs crept closer, snarling, but just in time, Hans came running back. He fought the animals off and saved both Margaret and the newborn. Meanwhile, Manuel and Robert returned to Eloise with a few stolen supplies. But she was furious. "This won't even last a week," she snapped. When they mentioned that Margaret was giving birth alone and needed help, Eloise's face turned cold. "Stay out of it," she ordered. "We don't get involved." Back at the cave, Hans rushed to Dr. Ritter for help. Dora immediately called out, "Bring her inside." Ritter quickly got to work, fighting to ease Margaret's agony. After hours of struggle, he managed to deliver the baby safely. Outside, Manuel watched from a distance, shaken. When he went back to tell Eloise what had happened, she lashed out again, warning that if Ritter and Hans became allies, it would ruin everything. That was the breaking point for Manuel. His patience snapped. "You're not a woman," he yelled. "You're a monster, feeding off people's misery." As the scorching summer rolled in, the island began to dry up completely. The once lush land turned into cracked earth. Even Ritter had lost his purpose, he had nothing left to write, and that emptiness was eating him alive. Elsewhere, Rudy, starving and dehydrated, staggered to Hans's house. Seeing his condition, Hans gave him food and water. And that's when Rudy revealed the shocking truth: Eloise was never rich. She wasn't a billionaire investor at all. She was just a delusional woman, obsessed with movie characters, living inside a fantasy world where she believed she was a queen and everyone else her servants. Even worse, she had been deliberately keeping Hans and Ritter apart, afraid that if the two ever joined forces, her manipulation would collapse. Then, one day, another ship appeared on the horizon. A man named Alan stepped ashore with a small research crew. He had come at Ritter's invitation to study his life on the island. When Eloise saw him, she quickly dressed up and greeted him with charm and false grace. That night, Alan hosted a small gathering. He praised Ritter's courage and discipline, saying his letters had inspired the world, that true happiness only comes after struggle. He congratulated Margaret on her newborn child and even complimented Eloise on her beauty. And that was enough. In Eloise's mind, a new plan began to form. She learned that Alan was a famous filmmaker with money and connections. To her, he was the perfect catch. She tried to seduce him, smiling, flattering, leaning in close. But Alan gently stopped her. "You're a remarkable woman," he said, "but I'm not interested in that. I only respect you, nothing more." The next morning, Alan left silently aboard his ship without saying a single word. Watching him go shattered Eloise completely, she couldn't believe someone had actually rejected her. Days later, when Ritter returned from hunting, he noticed the food he'd brought for Alan was gone, and soon realized Eloise had stolen it. That was the last straw. Furious, Ritter stormed straight to Hush's cabin. The two men agreed they'd had enough and would finally make Eloise pay. Grabbing their rifles, they stood outside her tent and shouted for her to return everything she'd taken. But Eloise only laughed mockingly and said, "You really think the one you're helping will feed you later? You're enemies, and you'll always be." It became clear her real goal had been to turn them against each other from the very beginning. Suddenly, Robert stepped out from inside the tent, pointing a gun straight at them. The situation was seconds away from chaos when Margaret rushed in just in time, calming everyone down. She ordered them all to go home and end it there. But Ritter's rage didn't fade. He returned home, smashed his typewriter to pieces, and stormed off into the wilderness with his rifle. Meanwhile, back at Margaret's house, a starving Rudy showed up begging for food, only to find Eloise outside, tears streaming down her face. "If you want to leave, then go," she said softly. "I've got nothing left to give you." Their eyes met, and in that moment of shared sorrow, they kissed. That same night, Hush suddenly woke to strange noises outside. Stepping out with his gun, he spotted someone stealing water and fired in anger, only to realize he'd shot Dora's favorite horse. Panic set in. If Dora found out, she'd lose her mind. The next morning, Dora noticed her chickens were sick and her horse was missing. Distressed, she rushed to Margaret's home, where the family pretended to know nothing. Then, suddenly, Dora collapsed. Hush carried her home, where Ritter was already waiting. As they discussed her condition, both men realized someone was listening. Outside, they caught Robert spying on them, proof that Eloise was pulling every string. Later that day, in the woods, they ran into Rudy again. Through tears, he confessed everything. He had stolen Dora's horse, but only because Eloise told him to. Now, full of regret, he insisted they had to stop her. So the men formed a plan. Hush sent his wife and son into the forest to gather firewood, while he, Ritter, and Rudy went to confront Eloise. When they reached her tent, she refused to come out. Then Robert suddenly burst out, attacking them. He managed to kill Rudy before Hush leapt from behind and stabbed him to death. Moments later, Eloise emerged, pretending to be innocent, claiming Robert had forced her to do everything. She tried to tempt them, promising to share her resort and make them rich. But Ritter had finally seen through every lie. Without a second thought, Ritter struck him on the head, and the man fell lifeless to the ground. The gunshot rang out across the island, carrying all the way to Margaret's home. Later, the three men worked together to drag the bodies of Eloise and Robert down to the shoreline, tossing them into the sea, and silently agreed that this secret would never be revealed to anyone. Not long after, Rudy came running toward the women, breathless and anxious. "Eloise and Robert have gone home," he said, holding up a letter they supposedly left behind. But both women immediately saw through the lie. Margaret turned to her husband and said, her voice low but firm, "I heard that gunshot. They're dead. I know Ritter did it." She warned him, her eyes sharp with fear and understanding. "Ritter is clever. He could easily manipulate Hush, and you need to be careful." Meanwhile, Dora had reached her limit with Ritter's constant manipulation and control. She told him flatly that she wanted nothing to do with him anymore. Ritter tried to reason with her, but she spat back, calling him a traitor. Enraged and humiliated, Ritter stormed off into the dense forest, pounding through the undergrowth in anger. It was there, amid the shadows of the trees, that he ran into Margaret. She held out a small basket of eggs, a simple gesture of kindness and calm in the midst of chaos. Ritter, still seething, refused to take them. For a brief moment, the tension hung in the air like a storm about to break, the forest echoing with silence, the weight of secrets pressing down on them both. Margaret, sensing his inner turmoil, leaned closer and quietly revealed the truth. Hush was the one who had killed Eloise. But Ritter, blinded by disbelief and rage, refused to accept it. Ritter refused to take the eggs Margaret offered, pride and irritation keeping him from accepting even the simplest gesture of kindness. At that moment, Margaret quietly revealed a shocking truth. Hush had been the one to kill Eloise. Ritter, however, refused to believe it, his mind clouded by disbelief and denial. Meanwhile, Rudy spotted a small boat approaching the island and desperately called out to the captain, pleading to be taken aboard. The promise of escape hung in the salty sea air, but the island's tension remained thick. Amid the chaos, Ritter finally found a spark of inspiration, a new story idea that thrilled him. He began writing with joy, the words flowing onto the page, and eagerly shared his excitement with Dora. She smiled, calling it a moment worth celebrating. But her celebration was a trap. She invited him back to her home under the pretense of a small feast, and there, under the guise of hospitality, she fed him tainted chickens. Within moments, Ritter began to feel violently ill, the poison coursing through his body. Panic erupted, and Dora ran to Margaret's house, crying, "My husband, he's very sick." Margaret and the others rushed to help, the island now a whirlwind of fear, suspicion, and desperation. The balance of life on the island had shifted again, and the shadows of betrayal were closing in from every direction. Everyone rushed to help, but it didn't take long for Margaret to realize the horrifying truth: Ritter had been poisoned. The poison was taking its cruel toll, and his strength was fading fast. In his final moments, Dora mocked him mercilessly, laughing at his struggle as he gasped for breath. Summoning the last of his energy, Ritter cursed her with a chilling warning: she would never know happiness. And then, with that bitter curse hanging in the air, he drew his final breath and died there on the island, alone and betrayed. Months later, the governor arrived on the island to investigate. But before his death, Ritter had sent him a letter, a final, calculated act, which placed the entire blame for Eloise's murder on Hush. The island, with all its secrets, violence, and lies, remained a place where truth and deception were forever entangled, leaving its survivors to navigate the treacherous legacy Ritter had left behind. An investigation was launched, but no concrete evidence ever surfaced. With nothing to hold on to, the governor eventually left the island, and Dora went with him. Hush and his family chose to stay behind. The island had become their home, their sanctuary after all the chaos and bloodshed. In the final chapters of this haunting story, we learn that Dora eventually left the island and moved to Germany, only to face a tragic end, succumbing to cancer. Yet before her death, she revealed the island's darkest secret: she had poisoned her own husband. This confession cast a shadow over everything that had happened, showing just how deeply deceit, fear, and desperation had taken root on that remote island. Meanwhile, the bodies of Eloise, Robert, and Manuel were never found. The sea had claimed them, leaving their fates shrouded in mystery. No one would ever know what truly became of them, and their absence served as a chilling reminder of the deadly consequences that human greed, obsession, and rivalry could unleash. At its heart, this story is not just about murder and betrayal. It is a reflection on the fragile nature of civilization and human relationships. Even in isolation, when people are removed from society and its rules, they struggle to coexist peacefully. Perhaps this explains what happened on the island. When the second family arrived, the fragile equilibrium was shattered. Insecurities, jealousy, and fear escalated to a point where neighbors turned against each other, old alliances crumbled, and the bonds that had barely held the first family together were destroyed entirely. The island, which had once promised safety, freedom, and a new beginning, became a crucible of human nature. It exposed the darkest corners of ambition, pride, and mistrust. Every secret, every lie, and every act of betrayal had consequences that rippled outward, shaping the lives and deaths of all who lived there. And so, this is where our story comes to its chilling close.